Hey, I'm Libby Shaw, and welcome to episode 4 of The Libby Shaw Show. And so, in today's episode, I'm going to be talking about 3 celebrity memoirs which have been released over the last couple of years that have really stood out to me. So, the first one is, of course, Matthew Perry, Friends, Lovers, and the Big Terrible Thing. Then there's Britney Spears, This Is Me. And then the last one, and probably the most surprising one, is Paris, the memoir, written by Paris Hilton, heiress to the Hilton empire, of course, and businesswoman in her own right. So I guess I'm going to start by talking about Matthew Perry's memoir. So after his tragic death last year, I decided to finally buy his memoir. Like, book sales skyrocketed, even though it had been released in 2022. And while most people remember him because of his role as Chandler in Friends, his memoir is actually really more about his personal struggles. And so in his memoir, he talks about how he grew up with an absent mother and, would often be shipped off to stay with his dad. He'd be, often in airports alone and sitting alone as an unaccompanied minor on flights, and how he was desperate for attention, which could explain partially why he decided to get into acting, but also he started out playing tennis, but then an injury forced him to stop playing tennis. So he was desperate to be accepted and to be loved. And just like his character in Friends, he used humor as a defense mechanism. And the book it's not entirely just about, his path to how he got the role, although that does form part of what the book is about. It's also mostly about his struggles with different drugs. And it's about how he was in and out of rehab for several years, and how he could never really have a long-term relationship because either they would leave or he'd get scared and he'd end up breaking up with them. So, he had a lot of problems. And what I really, it took me a while to read it. It took me probably, I'm normally a fast reader. It took me about 6 months to read it because it was just such a heavy read. He talks about some of the medical treatment he had while he was in the rehab centers. He talked about the pain. He talked about his interactions with different nurses. He talked about all of that. And I was basically left with the thought afterwards, if only he'd gotten the help that he needed, then he'd probably still be alive today. But of course, it's too late to say that now. And then that leads me on to the Britney Spears memoir, This Is Me, which came out last year. So her memoir was a very easy read, actually. So I read that in one sitting. I read it in a night on release day, and her chapters are very, very short chapters, short sentences, so very, very easy to read, very easy to understand. She talks about her upbringing, growing up with an abusive and alcoholic father, similar to Matthew Perry. There's actually one thing I forgot to say. Matthew Perry's father was an alcoholic. The only difference between Matthew Perry and his father is that his father was a functioning alcoholic, whereas Matthew Perry couldn't function with the alcohol. And Britney Spears' father, Jamie Spears, he of course would become violent when he was drunk and aggressive when he was drunk, and Britney would retreat to her bedroom. She'd retreat to singing and dancing. That was sort of like an escape for her. And then, as we all know, or as has been speculated over many years, this has never been confirmed, basically her mother, Jamie Lynn, also exploited her. Her mother exploited her for money and basically wanted to be a stage mum and wanted Britney to be number one so that the family could get more money, because unlike Matthew Perry, Britney didn't grow up with wealth. Like, they struggled financially a lot. So this was like, Britney was sort of their ticket to escaping that life, their life in poverty. Britney was their escape. But then, you know, for whatever reason, one thing led to another, and she had a lot of troubled relationships. And then, as we all know, in 2006, she had the famous breakdown where she shaved off all her hair. But the reason for that, as she details in the book, that was actually about her regaining her control. Because, you know, it was sort of like she didn't want to be a puppet anymore. She didn't want to be controlled by anyone anymore. And so chopping off all her hair was her way of saying, I am Britney. Don't tell me what to do. Which also inspired her next album, Circus, after Blackout, which was deemed a flop. But when you're selling millions of copies of an album, is that really a flop? I don't think so. Like, I think we need to sort of reevaluate what we consider a flop. Like, to me, a flop is something that sells, you know, like maybe 5 copies, like, or, you know, 1,000 copies, or just a few thousand copies. But if you're still selling millions, it's not a flop. And so the other thing is that because her family didn't treat her with respect, she was also put under a 13-year conservatorship, where she was institutionalized against her will. And despite her trying to escape, despite her trying to reason with various medical professionals and other professionals, nobody listened to Britney. Nobody actually thought that what she was saying could be true. They just sided with her father. I mean, isn't that kind of disgusting that back then, and we like to think this type of thing wouldn't happen today, but what's to say it wouldn't? I mean, I remember hearing about cases in the 1970s, you know, just a few years ago, where people were horrified about that type of thing. But institutional abuse does still happen. And, you know, Britney Spears is a product of that, and she was medicated against her will. And that has definitely altered her mental state. As, you know, we see with her videos and her pictures on her Instagram stories, when she has it activated, of course. And then the last memoir that I want to talk about is Paris Hilton's memoir. And so this one was a really interesting read, because Paris Hilton, she was basically, in the early 2000s, she and Nicole Richie and Nikki Hilton, her sister, you know, were kind of like the it girls. And Paris Hilton was basically like the first major influencer, you know, pre-social media time. She had her TV show, The Simple Life, and she received so much flack. Like, everybody thought she was this dizzy blonde, this blonde bimbo, a role that she played very well. And as she talks about in the book, it's actually exactly that, just a role that she played. Like, she would put on this baby voice, no different to what Britney did with her Baby One More Time voice. But the thing that really interested me about the book is that I was really, like, when Britney, Lindsay Lohan and Paris were, you know, going night clubbing together in the early 2000s, I was a little confused about how they became friends. Like, that seemed like such an odd match to me. But having read Paris Hilton's memoir, just finished it, like pretty much a few minutes before I started this video. Having just finished it, it actually makes sense, because Paris Hilton and Britney probably, I'm guessing here, they probably bonded over their shared trauma of being institutionalized against their will. So basically, when Paris was a teenager, she was date raped. She was also sexually assaulted by a teacher. She didn't realize at the time that it was, you know, grooming, but it was. And then she was raped another time, again, date rape. She has no recollection, like, this is detailed in the book. She has no recollection at all of what happened. Basically, she remembers taking Sprite to an event and being offered some other drink, saying no, but then she eventually was pressured into saying yes, and then she blacked out. And the next thing she recalls is waking up and wanting to get out of there. And then because Paris also snuck out a lot to go to parties when she was a teenager, her parents decided to send her to a school for troubled teenagers. And that school, if you haven't already heard of the school, it's called Provo Canyon School. And it can only be described as a torture facility. So Paris details being bullied, beaten, deprived of food, having all these absurd rules, again, similar to Britney, medicated against her will, threatened, told all these stories of how if she tried to escape, then, she'd probably be found dead in the bush. And it's recently come out in the last couple of years that there have actually been murders, deaths, and suicides associated with that school. And the other thing is that, so Paris escaped multiple times, but she was forcefully taken back to the school. Forcefully taken, dragged, kicking and screaming. Literally dragged, kicking and screaming. That's not an exaggeration. Read Paris Hilton's memoir for the full details on exactly what happened. It is truly disturbing, disgusting, and despicable, and it shouldn't be happening. And so in recent years, Paris has actually devoted some of her time to lobbying the American government against the troubled teen industry to ensure that schools like this are shut down. And so I guess the major takeaway from the Paris Hilton memoir in particular is that in the early 2000s, she played this ditzy character, but that was sort of like an escape for her. But underneath it all, she's a DJ, she's a singer, she's an actress, she has multiple business ventures, she has multiple real estate investments, and the main thing that really drives Paris is never wanting to be in a situation where someone else can control her life. So for her, money is not just money. It seems from reading the book that money for her is a way of ensuring your freedom. And it also really shows that, despite the media criticisms, people never really knew Paris in the early 2000s. In this book, if you do get a chance to read it, definitely do. It goes some way to explaining who the real Paris Hilton is. So anyway, thanks for tuning in. That's all for today. Hopefully I'll see you next time. Until then, bye.